Hello again. Alright, so here we go. Last portion of the skeletal lectures, and this one is on fracture repair. You see, one of the most common disorders of bones is that it's going to get broken, usually because of severe strain being put on the bone so that it overwhelms the rigidity of the bone itself. And so we call these things fractures. But fractures can come in two forms. There's stress fractures, which is this typical one where just putting too much pressure on the bone, it breaks. But there's also pathologic fractures where disease can lead to the reduction of bone mass so that it become more fragile, more brittle. And usually it's because of the pathology of some sort of disease that the bones now are at a much higher risk of breaking, rather than just sort of breaking spontaneously. They still have to have some pressure put on them, but they're more likely to break. But no matter what kind of fracture you go through, the method of repair is going to be pretty consistent. Right? So I'm going to clear some space here. I'm going to go like this. You start off with a bone that gets broken. Now, bone is vascular living tissue. So that means that when you break it, one of the first things that's going to happen is it's going to bleed in that area. Right? And so a lot of blood is going to fill that space from the broken blood vessels. And it's not just going to contain itself within where the break was, it's also going to be on the outside. Remember how on the outside there's that periosteum? Well, that periosteum is still there. It may have gotten broken during the fracture itself, but there's still going to be some of it there. And wherever you have periosteum, you have osteogenic cells. And let's not forget that inside of your bone, where you had your medullary cavity, you have bone marrow. And that's another surface, and that surface is also going to have osteogenic cells on the inside of the endosteum, the lining covering the inner surfaces of bone. Okay. So your fractured bone now is this big mess of blood clot, and that blood clot is called a hematoma. That is the first thing that is actually going to start to hold the two ends of broken bone together, the blood clot itself. Now, a blood clot is what you get when a whole bunch of protein fibers coalesce inside of a wounded area. To keep blood clotting pretty simple, in normal blood there should be no clots, but when you break a blood vessel, edges of the vessel are now exposed to blood components, particularly a protein called fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is now stimulated to coalesce around a mass of platelets that are accumulating at the site of the wound. So it starts to create this spongy mass of cellular material and protein fibers. And this is the beginning of a clot, which then is thick and sticky and is going to hold to the edges of the broken vessels and help eventually to reduce the amount of fluid that is escaping from those vessels so that your blood stays in your bloodstream. But it still means that you've got the first few protein fibers that are now gently holding one bone to another one. It's not a lot of fibers, it's pretty weak connecting these things together, but at least it's something holding those two bones together. It is at this point, of course, that you want to get your bones set and get them in a cast so that they don't move relative to one another while the healing continues. But the first thing, the hematoma clot, is actually going to bring some protein fibers to connect the two ends together, but very, very weakly. It's as strong as a scab. But then, from those osteogenic layers of tissue that are on the insides of the periosteum and endosteum, those osteogenic cells are now going to start moving into the clot space. And not just them, they're also going to be osteoclasts. They're going to be moving into that clot space too. After all, there might be some bone fragments in there, and we want osteoclasts in there to help destroy those fragments and dissolve them so they don't interfere with the healing. Okay? Plus, the osteogenic cells that moved into that area, well, a bunch of them are going to turn not into osteoblasts, not right away, they're going to turn into fibroblasts. So I'm just going to use more black here for that one. So fibroblasts are going to start to collect inside of your clot. And the job of fibroblasts is to grow protein fibers. And that's what's going to happen. You now start adding more protein to the clot that was already there. Your hematoma is now becoming tougher with the addition of more protein fibers. So this tissue we now call granulation tissue. It's still pretty soft. It's kind of like osteoid tissue in a way. But this stuff isn't going to calcify, not directly. But you do have granulation tissue that has granules, little masses of cells, in amongst a fairly fibrous material. So that's step 2. Step 3 is the beginning of the soft callus formation. Now the soft callus is going to be fibrocartilage. Well, we've already made the foundation for fibrocartilage because we've got protein fibers filling in the space where there used to be just a clot. Right? And now the osteogenic cells that had moved into this area, some of them are going to become chondroblasts. And the chondroblasts will now start to fill the spaces between the fibers with cartilage tissue, with cartilage matrix. And since there are fibers there, it's going to be fibrocartilage. And if you remember, fibrocartilage is one of the toughest but least elastic cartilages out there. So now we're filling that space that used to be a clot but then became granulation tissue filled with fibers and cells. We're now turning that into fibrocartilage. And it fills this area like so, and that is your soft callus. During this time, the endosteum has also probably been regrowing thanks to the actions of fibroblasts on the outside, repairing that dense fibrous tissue. But there's also probably going to be a lump here on the surface of the bone where your fracture is. Now the fibrocartilage mass on the inside is still not as hard as bone, so it's still softish, but it's a lot tougher than it used to be, and it's helping to keep the bones held together. So your soft callus is made. Now comes the creation of the hard callus. The hard callus is going to be bone. And we've got a whole mass of cartilage here in the space where we want bone to be. And that means we're going to be going through endochondral ossification and following a lot of the same steps. Okay? First thing we're going to do is create a bony collar. And the bony collar is going to be forming here on the periphery of your soft callus surface. And this is the first bone that is going to hold bone to bone. As it forms here. And finally we've got a continuum of bone on either side. Now, that bony collar is going to be grown through intramembranous ossification. The osteogenic cells that are just underneath the periosteum will become osteoblasts. Osteoblasts will lay down osteoid tissue, which then becomes spongy bone, fill in the holes, make a compact bone, and thus we end up with our bony collar wrapped around the soft callus with a shell of hard bone. So crunchy on the outside, chewy in the middle. Then we go through the other steps of endochondral ossification. The chondrocytes that are inside of that soft callus middle, they're going to go through their cell hypertrophy, then they'll go through their cell apoptosis where they die, leave behind some sort of hollow space. That hollow space will then be invaded by osteogenic cells, which we've already said are already there. Those osteogenic cells will become osteoblasts. The osteoblasts will lay down osteoid tissue, and that osteoid tissue will then form into spongy bone. So now we have a massive spongy bone filling in the space where there used to be cartilage. Until finally all the cartilage is gone, and all I've got left is a hard callus of spongy bone where there used to be fibrocartilage. Like so. But we're not quite done yet. You see, the bone's not quite where it used to be. It used to be a nice smooth bone without any extra bumps on it. So the last stage of any fracture repair is remodeling. In order to get rid of the extra bone that is here, we are dependent on osteoclasts once more. So the osteoclasts will now get rid of whatever spongy bone is filling in the medullary cavity, right? And they'll also get rid of the bone that is forming the hard callus on the outside underneath the periosteum. Now, depending on how bad the fracture was, you may always end up with a lump on the outside of your fractured location. Right? If there was a lot of scar tissue in that area, then fibrosis is going to prevent the complete regeneration of tissue. But under normal circumstances, if it's a very simple, clean break, then osteoclast will remove excess bone, right? And the periosteum will just sort of go back down to its former location on the surface. Right? So we'll put the periosteum back on, like that. Okay. And inside, any spongy bone that was filling up the medullary cavity, that also gets consumed by the osteoclast, and voila, you've got it. You've got now completely healed bone, healed periosteum on the outside, healed endosteum on the inside, and all that you may have left over is a little bit of scar tissue that you might not be able to see on the bone with the naked eye, but an x-ray would always show that there was a healed fracture in that spot. Alright, so the steps are as follows. You're going to first have the formation of a hematoma, followed by the turning of that hematoma into granulation tissue, which is mostly fibrous connective tissue plus clusters of cells like osteogenic cells, fibroblasts, and osteoclasts. Then the granulation tissue will turn into a soft callus of fibrocartilage thanks to chondroblasts forming in that space. Then the soft callus will get covered on the outside with a bony collar, and then the inside of the fibrocartilage will be transformed to bone through endochondral ossification, and thus you formed your hard callus. And then the last step is that your hard callus will be remodeled. The remodeling phase is accomplished thanks to osteoclast wearing away the bone where it's unnecessary. But depending on how severe the fracture is, you may end up with scar tissue that leads to a mass still being palpable on the surface where the fracture used to be. Okay? But there you go. Those are all the phases of fracture repair, and that takes care of the skeletal system. So, shut this one down, and next set of lectures are going to be on joints and their classification. So, bye-bye for now.